Star Wars Total War. Oh, God help me, no. Okay, well, you know what? Actually, no. This is the superior alternative to 40k Total War, I suppose, which the rumors are also suggesting was in development, and I would rather they go and violate some other poor bastard's most favorite franchise than mine, so I guess there's a certain silver lining in this, but okay. See, here's the issue. Well, actually, there are several issues here which I find mildly amusing. One of which is the recent Total War game, Pharaoh, was a much more grounded approach compared to previous entries. Total War's just a fantasy setting now, isn't it? There's no historical Total War anymore. It's just Warhammer and Three Kingdoms, which, to be fair, Three Kingdoms was essentially a fantasy setting the way they put it, but Pharaoh now is being brought up as the unusual historical Total War game. Oy boy. But, alright, that's more of a funnier side. So, the Star Wars thing. I've had several people mention rumors about a 40k Total War and asking me what I think about it. I think it's a terrible goddamn idea, because Total War doesn't really do ranged combat very well, and it certainly doesn't do skirmish-based ranged combat very well at all, as the entire Total War structure is built around blocks of units moving against each other and engaging against one another in a fairly fixed pattern. Whereas modern warfare with ballistic weaponry, guns, lasers, artillery, works out very, 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 very differently. And you would need to introduce some form of a skirmishing system, some form of a loose order system. You would need to introduce cover. You would need to introduce abilities or weapon abilities towards different targets, like armor, tanks, for example, being effectively immune to it. You need to introduce things like perhaps ruins, buildings, or at the very least walls or something to hide behind and so on. And a lot of this was attempted in Empire Total War, which was, of course, an epic failure. In fact, the entire Total War engine that we have today was initially designed around the idea that it was supposed to be a more flexible Total War engine that could handle both ranged combat with muskets, etc., and then sword and board combat in the more traditional historical vein. The problem was that what they actually ended up with then was an engine that couldn't do either one very well. It didn't do large-scale melee combat very well, and it struggles with unit collision to this day, which even the modders are having a hard time trying to fix. And having played Medieval 2 recently, oh my god, the difference in how units behave when it comes to collision is night and day. And even worse still, it didn't handle ranged combat very well either, due to the way it calculated ranged damage with the new hit point system. You can see this even worse in Rome, amongst other things. But the idea then of having a Total War Star Wars game, which would focus, well, I would imagine, damn near exclusively on ranged combat, and not with muskets or massed formations, but stormtroopers, rebels, or I guess you could go back to, Old Republic, Gungans and droids and so on. Melee is a rather limited element in these various settings. I suppose you could go even further back, Sith Empire level back, and you certainly have more melee combat then, but even so, it seems like you're going to have to upend pretty much the entirety of the Total War formula to get this to work. Now, I will point out as well, in one point of desperate hope, there used to be a series called Total Warrior, which was kind of Total War in the Total War engine, kinda, but third-person hacky-slashy nonsense. It's possible that the, if you've already got your trusted insider going, ah yes, you know that Total War series, that primarily fantasy and science fiction focused Total War series? Yeah, that one. It's making a Star Wars title now, that they might not know about Total Warrior and might have confused the two, or it's even entirely possible now Then this one says Total War Star Wars game. But in the various other articles I've seen covering this, they've not actually mentioned Total War. They've mentioned that Creative Assembly is working on a Star Wars game, which is more realistic. Now, you'd think that after the absolute epic disaster that was Hyenas, Sega would be holding the reins very tightly around CA's neck, making sure they didn't engage with anything outside of their usual wheelhouse, which would seem to preclude a, non-Total War Worry game, But it's still a theoretical possibility. And God, can you imagine the naval battles? Total War naval battles have never been very good. The closest they came was probably in Empire, and it was completely ruined by the fact that the AI didn't know how the naval battles worked, and so it couldn't engage with things like the wind, for example, or anything like that. It simply just did an attack order, and every single battle ended in an enormous retardant clusterfuck as every individual ship maneuvered against every other individual ship, rather than, line battles as they would have had back then. In Star Wars, they could simply just elect to go for the Creative Assembly solution these days, which is, if you can't make the system work right out of the box, simply ignore it, delete it, and move on. But a Star Wars game without naval battles? How would you even do the campaign map? Would you do multiple planets? Would you do a galactic-style, multiple planet combat system? In which case you'd have to have space travel of some sort. Would you do just one planet divided into multiple zones? In which case I guess you could ignore it. But okay, you're gonna do a Star Wars Total War game without space combat. Okay, you better make the ground combat really amazing then, and somehow I just do not see that happening. I suppose what they could do is, basically make smaller units so that your unit size is like 30 to 60 individuals. You increase the hit point bar, you add in a simplistic cover system, and then you give them a loose order, basically, to kind of simulate cover in a way and simulate the small unit operations of modern day combat instead. Which, see, the problem is at the end of the day, all of this would really just be a mod-level reskin solution to the problem, rather than one special made to deal with this kind of combat. It would simply be taking Star Wars combat and forcing it brutally into the mold of a Total War game, or vice versa, I suppose, which I have this sneaking suspicion is not going to end up working out very well, as regardless of what you're going to do, one or the other is going to have to bend to the other specifics. I see virtually no way that Total War is going to work in a Star Wars setting or in a 40k setting, or overwhelmingly ranged combat in general beyond maybe World War I, I guess, as there was certainly, especially early on, elements of large-scale, column-style assaults during World War I. In fact, the idea of overwhelming wave assaults remained a strategy throughout the conflict, until the very last years, really, where the Germans first and then eventually the Allies began understanding the idea of smaller unit assaults on fortified positions, utilizing expertly trained men to break through, and then following it up with waves of armor and larger numbers of men thereafter once the front line had been breached and so on. So you could sort of do it in a Total War World War I setting, but even that would be pushing it. Not to mention, how are you going to integrate tanks, armored vehicles, artillery against all of this? Because usually in traditional Total War, whenever you add in an artillery unit, you end up having them blow up half the enemy army via splash damage, which I suppose would be, if nothing else, accurate to the Gungans fighting the droids. Or, God help you, aircraft? I suppose you could simulate them via spells, basically? An air traffic controller casting bombing run? Again, it would all be these kind of half-assed mod-level solutions to problems that simply don't fit into a Total War game. And if all you want is essentially a mod, frankly, there is going to be better solutions than Creative Assembly. I have a hard time seeing how this is going to be good, but it'd be an interesting experiment in failure, if nothing else, I do suppose. What do you guys think, though? Star Wars Total War, is that anything you are even remotely hopeful for? Do you think it could be good? Do you think they could somehow fang-dangle the already not exactly excellent Total War engine into dealing with a completely radically different style of warfare? And if so, why? Or maybe, I suppose, the even more optimistic answer would be that they were finally working on a new engine. But if they are repeating the errors of Empire, working on an engine that is intended to do ranged combat over melee combat, well, I'd look back at the history of modern-day Total War and ask you if that seems like such a damn good idea. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.